Well, it is good to be back with you for another day of Bible study as we are continuing on our journey through perspective shift. On this journey, we are trying to identify which parts of the church God intended to be in place and hopefully maintain or retain those things, and anything that is fluff or that is problematic, let go of. And part of this journey has helped us to understand maybe more so how we should be interacting with the church and with Christian people as well. So it's been good to have you along on the ride for this journey, all of it brought to you thanks to the generosity of those who are a part of Christ's Table. If you'd like to find out more about Christ's Table, you can visit that URL right there, www.christtable.today. Make sure while you're there to sign up for the email list so that we can keep you updated on everything that is happening around Christ's Table. One of the things that's coming up very soon is we have a resource box every couple of months that we send in the mail to those who are supporters of Christ's Table. All you have to do to become a supporter is go to that URL right there, www.christtable.today, and you can give there online. And to everybody who is a giver regularly of Christ's Table, what we do is we send a resource box in the mail that has a whole lot of spiritual resources for you to utilize over the next few weeks after you receive the box to guide your spiritual journey, to guide your family's spiritual journey. There's a lot of fun in the box too, and this one is all centered around this idea of unity. The Olympics are coming up, and so we thought that it would be a great time to focus on that, and we're looking forward to sending this to you, so don't delay in getting that. Either way, whether or not you sign up for our email list or give and become a financial supporter of Christ's Table, we are thankful that you can be a part each and every day of this Bible study. If you'd like to download the guide for the study and the reading list, you can go to this website, go.christtable.today/perspective shift. There you will find a PDF that will give you all the information that you need to know in order to participate alongside on the journey with us. Let's dig in. As we come to Acts chapter 17 and the end of that chapter, we are now finally landing on what is one of the perhaps most well-known and most often taught passages in the book of Acts. It is Paul in the city of Athens, where he is speaking in front of the Areopagus. Athens was well known for being in the ancient world not just a central city of the ancient world, but Athens is also a center of academia. Athens is also a center of thought, and Athens is a center of philosophy. And so the Areopagus would be where people would go to discuss and listen to philosophy, different ideas, scholars and academics teach. It was a very heady place. For some of us, that sounds wonderful, the type of people who may go to school or take college classes just for the fun of it. Others of us, that doesn't sound exciting or interesting at all. Paul, though, has a motive beyond just discussion and heady thinking. Paul's motive is obviously to help people understand the power and the presence of Jesus Christ and how that can and should change life and change direction. And so that's where we find ourselves when we come to today's reading, Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Here we go. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. So imagine maybe a lecture hall. Now this was outside, likely. Imagine stadium seating, people sitting around. So Paul, standing before this council, addresses them in this way. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines. And one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the God that I'm telling you about. So Athens was very well known for being a center of worship for all of the gods. And there were a lot. God of war, God of fertility, God of agriculture, God of rain, God of sun, etc., and on and on and on. And there, it seems, was a shrine to each and every one of any of the known gods in the ancient world that was there. But they had this shrine to an unknown god, it would seem. Why would you have a shrine for worship to an unknown god? Maybe there was just simply a question mark there, or a god with a blank face. Who knows? What we do know is that this was relatively common because the fear was in the ancient world that if some god felt jilted, then they might wreak havoc or destruction on your city. And so the reason why Athens had shrines of worship to all of the known gods was to try to appease and keep happy all of the gods so that they would not get jealous, well, that all of the other gods have a shrine, but I don't have a shrine, so I'm going to bring destruction upon this city in a way that only I can. The god of war, it'd bring war. The god of fertility would bring infertility. The god of agriculture might bring a drought. The god of sun would bring clouds or a terrifying eclipse in order to punish you for not paying attention to them. So this idea of an unknown god is something of a fail-safe. It's a safety mechanism. Just in case there was some god out there that they were not yet aware of, that this unknown god would see that there was a shrine to them, and they would be able to receive worship and pleasure and keep the jealousy at bay, as it were. We're so advanced, right? I mean, we don't do these things, right? I mean, look at them. These ancient nitwits. But we do this too, right? I mean, we do. We do this as well. You know, we're we're praying to Peter, Paul, and Mary whenever we get into a thick of something that we can't handle. If we're not a follower of God or Jesus, we're praying to God, making promises, a God who we may not even know. And we keep fail-safes around too, though our fail-safes are usually a lot different looking. Our unknown God is our bank account, our 401k. Our unknown God is the equity that we have in our house. Our unknown God is our doctor. Our unknown God is oftentimes our spouse, sometimes even our children. It's the fail-safe. If the God who we know doesn't come through for us, then we have built up around us unknown gods that we worship, that are our fail-safe, that we can fall back on in that moment where God, if it doesn't bring that job through, or if he doesn't bring that healing to the medical situation that we're facing through, if he doesn't bring this or that or the other two, then we have an unknown God, a fail-safe that we worship at the altar of. We're not that far removed from Athens. And Paul may be preaching to us as well. Paul continues, he is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. I love that. He doesn't live in man-made temples. God doesn't live in a church building. God doesn't live in any building, as it were. That time is long past. The last time God lived in a building was way back in the Old Testament. God doesn't live in church. And yet we still think of God as living in church. If we want to meet God, where do we go? We go to a church building. If we feel especially wrecked by something that's going on in our life emotionally, and we need to feel the presence of God, we tend to want to be in church, to light a candle, to be at the altar, to confess to a priest. But the Bible is clear, and Paul is here as well, that God doesn't live in church. So what do we do with that? Well, there is this idea of thin spaces where the walls between here and the walls between there, or where God is, being especially thin in certain places. And for many of us, that is church. The wall between God and between us seems especially thin in church for many of us. Now, is that nature? Is that nurture? Well, we don't have time to get into that. But for others of us, those thin spaces happen in nature. Those thin spaces happen when we are around friends or family. Those thin spaces happen whenever we're in our grandparents' home or on their property, a place that may be especially meaningful in you in your life or in your family's life. Maybe around the table, over food. There are, though, I think for all of us, thin spaces, and we should recognize where those places are and utilize them so that we will feel close to God in those moments where God feels far from us. But that place does not have or need to be a church. Paul tells us that God does not live in temples made by human hands. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. From one man, he created all of the nations throughout the whole earth. So Paul is now giving them an education on this unknown God. He decided beforehand when they should rise and when they should fall, and he determined their boundaries. There was this idea that oftentimes, unless the gods were needed, that they were hands-off. Paul says, no, this God is hands-on. His purpose, though, for being hands-on was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. The idea was that these gods are far away. Paul says, no, he's not far from us, and more specifically, more personally, he's not far from you. For in him we live and move and exist, and as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Paul here quotes from two separate secular places in poetry and in writing in those days, and so Paul actually kind of steals or plagiarizes this line, for in him we live and move and exist, or some versions will say have our being, and as some of your own poets, and Paul outs himself here and says we are his offspring, we are the children of God. Not everything that the world produces is bad. I love that Paul utilizes the own context of the secular world around him, the culture around him, in order to make his point and make his case. There's a stream of Christian thinking that says that we must divorce ourselves from the world, that we must completely and totally separate ourselves in the world, that we have to be out of it. I think maybe oftentimes the motivation for that is positive, because we don't want to end up looking like everybody else in the world. We don't want to end up with people thinking, there is no transformation or no difference whenever we follow Christ. But I don't think that those differences oftentimes play out in reality the way that the people who think we should separate from the world believe that they should look. No drinking, no smoking, no dancing, no rock and roll, no television, no skirts above the knees, no hair over the ears, no facial. When you get into this legalistic mindset of what a Christian looks like and what makes one holy, you go off the rails. And you go off the rails whenever you try to make a Christian look different from the world or separate from the world. Jesus himself in John at the prayer just before he goes to the cross, says that we should be in the world, not of the world, but not out of the world. That we have to remain in the world and its systems and its thinking and its contexts and our relationships, but not of it. Participating in it isn't being of it. It means that you recognize that you are from something different. But Jesus said, not out of the world. Don't be out of the world. And don't feel guilty for living in the culture, for embedding yourself in the culture around you, for enjoying it. I mean, for heaven's sake, what is wrong with enjoying the world that God gave you? If you really want to do a deep dive into this topic, we call that idea that there is truth outside of the church, that there is truth and beauty in the world, and oftentimes that truth and beauty comes from people who are far from God, comes from artists who are far from God, comes from musicians who are far from God, comes from scholars and thinkers who are far from God, comes from family members and grandparents who are far from God, and yet oftentimes they speak truth, they sing truth, they paint truth, they sing beauty, they paint beauty, they think beautifully. This is called, here's the term, general revelation. That all good things and all wonderful things come from God, even if the person who created them wasn't necessarily intending for it to be from God or to speak truth about God, and yet it does. Not everything that the world produces is wrong or bad, and I might even say that there is very little, if anything, that the world produces that is truly bad or terrible or evil. I think that it lies in the heart of all of us and oftentimes overtakes many of us. But the truth of the matter is that whenever we create, we are reflecting the image of God within us. How we use those creations can be used in ways that destroy, or can be used in ways that bring health and hope and life. Not everything the world produces is wrong or bad. And since that's true, we should think of God as an idol design. We shouldn't. Freudian slip. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. God overlooked people's ignorance about all of these things and who he was in earlier times, but now he commands everyone everywhere to repent of their sins and to turn from him, to recognize him. For he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed, and he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. He's speaking of Jesus. When they heard Paul speak about the resurrection of the dead, some laughed in contempt, but others said, we want to hear more about this. So that ended Paul's discussion with them, but some joined him, and some became believers. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the council, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. People laughed at Paul. But you know what? People are always going to laugh. People are always going to throw stones at you, and we say that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us. But let's be honest, words do hurt. Words can cause trauma. But at the end of the day, even if you're limping away from somebody who's harmed you, do your best to ignore them. Ignore the hyenas. Ignore those who laugh at you. Ignore those who chase you, who try to cause you harm. Most of the people there laughed with contempt at Paul. But a few of them didn't. And for that, it was worth it. No matter what you've gone through or what you may be going through right now, there may be a lot of people who are laughing at you. Don't give up. Press on. Some people are listening. They may not be letting anybody else know that they're listening. You may be suffering publicly, and yet people are affirming you privately. Press on. Ignore the hyenas. And until next week, happy reading.